There we go. Becky?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see you all on Zoom, and I hope to see you more in our in-person events coming up. Dan has planned a really fabulous schedule for the year. I'm looking forward to all these programs that we're going to have coming up. But just to tell you a little more about today's program, I'm just going to give you some background. So during the Great Depression, the US federal government launched the America Eats Project, which was an attempt to chronicle the country's varied regional foodways. It was part of the Federal Writers Project, also known as FWP, to partially employ out-of-work writers with the intention of producing a book chronicling the tremendous range of foods eaten across the United States. Unfortunately, funding for the project was diverted to war efforts, and the project languished in the archives for years. So in Taste of the Nation, Dr. Camille Buchan shapes a cultural and sensory history of New Deal era eating from the FWP archives, describing in mouthwatering detail how Americans tasted their food. She also illustrates how nostalgia, prescriptive gender ideals, and racial stereotypes shaped how the FWP was able to frame regional food cultures as American. So Dr. Buchan is a food historian and award-winning author who has published on American culinary history. She is currently at work on a family food history project, and her essay, Don't Wait for Me for Lunch, A Voyage in Memory Collage Through a Family Food Archive, is available in the latest issue of Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. So without further ado, I'm going to have Dr. Buchan come on, and I'm going to say, please put any questions in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring it throughout her presentation, and we can take questions afterwards. And as Mark just said, please mute yourself so that we can hear Dr. Buchan and without any interruptions. So Dr. Buchan, feel free to share your screen.
My apologies, this is right when my technology is leaving me. I will share my screen right away. Here we go. Here we go. We're good? You can all see this?
Looks great, thank you.
All right, so thank you for having me today. I'm delighted to be with you. I want to say here, but here really is my home office. I'm in Toronto, Canada. And just so you don't get distracted during my talk, the accent, I know people try to place the accent. It is not French-Canadian. It is just French. And I also want to say that in my home today, there is a toddler, and it is his bedtime. My partner totally has this, and the door is closed and locked. But if you see, if you see me making a worried face, this is what's happening. Yeah, that's all I will say about that. And I can't mute myself, so I don't think you'll hear yells, but just so you know, this is what's happening. So tonight, I want to give you a taste of my book, which is called, as Becky mentioned, Taste of the Nation, The New Deal Search for America's Food. And it's a project I worked on for close to a decade. And that came out in 2016 with the University of Illinois Press. So it's actually been really nice to go back to this material for tonight, because I hadn't looked at it in a while. And I'm very happy to say that the book then went on to win the Best Book Award from the Association for the Study of Food and Society. So it was really nice to be recognized by my peers for my work. And you may not agree with me, but I think it has the best title. No, not the best title. Well, the best cover ever. When they first sent it to me, I was absolutely delighted. because it's fierce and it gets to the point. The stripes obviously evoke the American flag, but to me, it also evokes a furrow in a wheat or cornfield. And if you can see the nice marbling, it also evokes a nice juicy steak. And the fork makes it quite clear. It's about eating and commensality. We're here to talk about food in American history, and it might not all be pretty. It might get a bit bloody. And the subtitles gives you the time periods, the New Deal, the 1930s. Now, if I tell you food in the 1930s, what pops into your mind? Maybe you can write it in the chat. I'm gonna give you a little bit of time because I'm curious to see, what coming fresh to this, what you would think if I tell you food 1930s.
We're getting soup lines as one. I personally think of the Great Depression, just not having enough to eat.
Exactly. So
Poverty.
yeah, images such as this, which is what we often think of when we think about food in the 1930s. Well, my well-known images of hunger and despair on the bread lines. Well, my work shifts the focus away from the bread lines and focuses instead on the reassuring images of community gathering and public eating produced by the New Deal state itself. And by this, I mean events such as this spaghetti dinner in Tantiton, Arkansas, or this barbecue in the aptly named Python, New Mexico. And the book really is a history of what I call New Deal food writing. So when I say New Deal, I mean both the time period of 1932 to 1941, but I'm also talking precisely about the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal programs. Because the federal government, the US federal government, created all the sources I used for the book. And so when I refer to New Deal food writing, it really refers to the body of culinary knowledge collected, written, and organized by the staff of the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, from 1935 to 1942. And here, welcome to the famous New Deal alphabet soup, because what was the FWP? It was part of the larger Works Progress Administration, which was a relief agency set up by the Roosevelt administration to provide work to the millions of unemployed Americans during the Depression. So the WPA is most famous for its work electrifying the Tennessee Valley with the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the FWP was one of the many work relief agencies sponsored by the New Deal state as part of its arts project. So there were also projects for painters, and you might be familiar with their most famous work are murals that they painted in post offices across the United States. But it was also a project for musicians and a project for theater people. So the project for writers, the FWP, provided work for, well, as its name would indicate, writers, but also really broadly white-collar workers. In other words, those who could not, or maybe would not, pick up a shovel. And really, in a way, anybody who could type. And it did so for up to 7,000 people. So it is quite a large undertaking. And the writers published hundreds of guidebooks to US states and cities. And these were really bestsellers. And they're actually really great to read even today. It's full of Americana and great photographs. And a fun exercise you could do is, buy the one for Pennsylvania or a state that you want to visit and try to use it as your current guidebook. I guess I'm saying that it's something I've always wanted to do, haven't had a chance to do it yet. But the FWP also recorded folklore, and quite famously, they conducted oral history interviews with descendants of enslaved people in the South. And all these projects and books contain stories about food. But the core of New Deal food writing is the material that they collected for a book that was to be entitled America Eats. And the goal of America Eats was to document regional cuisines with a specific focus on group meals and community gatherings. Now, the book was never published, but all the material produced for the book were sent to the Library of Congress when the FWP folded in 1942 because of World War II. And so it was sent to the Library of Congress, as well as a number of smaller local archives where they remain today, to the delight of historians. So today, what is this here? Yeah, in the first part of my talk, I want to explore the main themes of New Deal food writing and America Eats in particular. So who were the writers that worked on these projects? What did they write about? Why and how? What was new about the America Eats project? But also, what were the limits of the project? Then I want to move on so that we can look at a couple of examples together of how New Deal food writing documented regional food, since it was their goal, but also immigrant food, what we would call today ethnic food, what they called national group eating, an interesting way of putting it. Then I will offer conclusions and suggest further readings. So first, let's meet the writers. Oops, sorry. So the FWP was a pyramidal organization. We have at the top educated federal editors in Washington. And these editors were liberal New Dealers, ideologically aligned with the Roosevelt administration. And at the base of the pyramid were state bureaus employing local writers. So these local writers were a motley crew, from future literary superstars such as Richard Wright or Nelson Algren to unemployed small-town journalists or secretaries. And apart from the well-known figures, we do not know much about these local writers. They did not always sign their work, or they only signed with their last name. And not many wanted to publicize their participation in the project after the war, since after all, this was relief work. Few were talented, and they relied on well-worked metaphors and cliches. So to give you a sense of what I mean by this, we have the opening of the main essay from the state of Pennsylvania is on Pennsylvania Dutch cooking. And this is how the writer figure, we only have the last name, opened it. From the beginning of time, mankind has been interested in eating, fond of eating, insistent on eating. So it will be until mankind is no more. Eating is essential to health. It is necessary to life, no matter how or where one lives. And that means that every man, woman, and child in Pennsylvania likes to eat. This is quite the start. You know, there's such a thing as the funnel when you start your essay. This is basically whenever I teach undergraduate, this is how I tell them not to start their essay. You don't start a history essay with from the beginning of time. But the idea of America Eats came from the top of the pyramid. It came from the federal editors, and they really wanted America Eats to be the culinary crown of the project. And one of the key elements to understand New Deal food writing are the letters, memorandums, book outlines that were exchanged between the federal level and the state bureaus. And as you will see, I will often come back to these letters and memorandum during my talk, because they really document some of the misunderstandings, but also alignments between those liberal New Dealers and people on the relief line. So what did the book proposal outline? Well, the goal was to produce a book on American regional food traditions and group meals. This is how they, the editors called it. They insisted that it was not to be a cookbook, but rather an entertaining read with a light tone and a focus on human interest, something that would awaken the senses. So we are very much used to long-form food writing nowadays. There's such thing as travel food writing, but such a lively, almost ethnographic account of food, inviting readers to vicariously eat and travel, was pioneering. And we need to remember this. Because what the editor wanted, they wanted America Eats to tell the story of what people have eaten because they liked it, not what they ought to eat or what poor selection of food has done to them. For the Federal Writers Project, good eating did not necessarily come from professional chefs, but rather from the vernacular knowledge of local cooks. So the book proposal explains that recipes should be collected from a politician, the cook of a man or a woman known for the food he provides at his table, a restaurant keeper, a cattleman, a prominent horse owner, a miner, a storekeeper, or a hobo. Only teachers of cooking and writers of cookbooks should be barred. So in the middle of the Depression, that a hobo would be considered more of a food expert than a home economics teacher was a provocative statement. And this outlook really clashed with the late 19th century, early 20th century nutritional order that gave authority to nutritional experts, home economists, and cookbook authors, indeed. So really there was it was a really a novel approach. We have to really keep that in mind, because progressive era understandings of food built on an American Puritan tradition that considered pleasure, what people have eaten because they liked it, as suspicious. And food authorities considered that food choices should not be made out of taste preferences or appetite, but should rather follow the recommendations of the newly established field of nutritional science. And especially after the discoveries of calories and vitamins in the 1920s, nutrition advice submerged American audiences and helped redefine what good food was in American mind. And this new understanding was really that food should be fuel for bodies rather than pleasurable. And it really reshaped American diets and food culture in the progressive era. So here on this slide, I've put up a few examples of what that meant. So we have an ad for vitamins. We have a branded a recipe book, cookbook, that can be taken as an example of early American diet culture, since it asks women in particular here, I think it's obvious, to be fit, not fat, and explains how to reduce calories. And then we have an example of how a home economic expert was, in this case, Miss Nora Altic, was recruited to sell one of the many new technologies that entered American kitchen in the interwar period. Here, an electric range, but this is also when we see the first refrigerators. And this is why, as part of the relief work, it was important that all of the country would be electrified so that potentially everybody could have access to these new kitchen technologies. And so food reformers and experts into the 1930s were not so much, because these are all from the 1930s, they were not so much concerned with how food tasted as with whether it provided needed nutrients, vitamins, and calories. And if you want to know more about this topic, I highly recommend the book Modern Food, Moral Food by Helen White. And she really goes quite deeply into that. But as I explained with the few quotes early on, New Deal food writing really intentionally displaced the focus away from scientific nutrition and toward a reevaluation of taste. And the federal editors and the local writers really aligned on that, because from Delaware to California, the local workers complained about, quote, the all-pervasiveness of modern etiquette books and the equally pervasive educational propaganda, we've seen a few examples, towards an adequate and balanced diet that had turned the fine art of eating in a pseudo-scientific search for a lost vitality hidden in the juice of a raw carrot. And this is by Don Dolan from the California Federal Writers Project. I also like his title, Food à la Concentrate. And in this essay, he actually really writes about food in Los Angeles. And it's actually, this is quite funny. But he also goes on to report about things like tacos, which he describes as a new sandwich. But what we have to remember is that the Federal Writers Project really aimed to recenter taste in American eating, and it was a hedonistic project. Another key goal of the federal editors with America Eats was to document regional food. So the project aimed at collating local reports into 5 regional essays that they called section essays on the Northeast. These are the states from the Northeast, the South, the Middle West, the Far West, an interesting category, and the Southwest. And this is going fast, but if you look at these, at the Far West and the Southwest, you can see that California is included in both, because the federal editors considered that Southern Californian cuisine aligned with the Southwest, while Northern Californian cuisine aligned better with the Far West in their culinary regions. And in these regions, they wanted reports on only group eating, things such as church picnics, clam bakes, festivals, town barbecues. So why this focus on group eating? Well, the editors deemed home kitchens overrun by the product of the food industry. They feared that foodways and taste were becoming uniform across the country. Indeed, the 1930s was a decade during which industrial food, developed since the late 19th century, became entrenched in American kitchens. Canned fruits, canned mayonnaise, sliced bread, iceberg lettuce, canned meat or canned crab, as in the recipe booklet that's on the screen right now. All of this were not novelty items anymore, but they had become a cheap, quick way of feeding your family. No comment on the exoticism of the ad for the geisha brand crab. There's too much to say there, so I will not go into it. But the editor wanted to focus on community gathering because they considered that these events upheld local culinary traditions. No one would dare serving store-bought foods to such events. As they explain in a rather telegraphic style in the book outline, America Eats would report on the devastating effects on cookery as an art and on public taste by introduction of labor-saving devices and mass production. The frying pan almost wrecks America. The art of cooking preserved by social gatherings, especially those of the nostalgic variety, family and pioneer reunions. Some of the writers met them there and took it even further, such as O. Abrahamson from Massachusetts, who explains that in taking their rightful place in world affairs, the weaker sex have, to a large extent, deserted their pots and pans and turned over their culinary responsibilities to the manufacturers of prepared food. And this is in an essay called Cape Cod Culinary Goodies, so it's a little bit, this was not called for. But as this latest quote makes clear, the whole traditional versus industrial food debate was heavily gendered. And women were accused of following the dictate of the food industry and nutrition experts. And indeed, women were the targets for all of the various ads that I've been showing you. And so because they were being bought, they bought into this propaganda, as the FWP put it, they were therefore in the mind of the federal editors and some of the local writers, depriving their families of tasty, local, and traditional food. And it's important in this context to remember that the 1930s was a decade of male anxieties, as many could not fulfill the customary role of breadwinner anymore, and as female employment increased. So New Deal food writing kept women in the kitchen and really showcased men cooking in public. And it's really interesting because if there's, in these community gatherings that they're describing, it tends to be that the women prepare traditional food in the kitchen and then bring it to the picnic, while we see a lot of men cooking in public in America Eats. And so we have, for example, these photographs taken at the 1941 Los Angeles Sheriff's Barbecue. And I find them quite telling, and I really like them because of their conflation of what I called meat, men, and muscles. And these unapologetic events contrasted with the bland, allegedly feminizing industrial food that women would be accused of feeding to their families. Now, one thing that's a little bit, it's going to appear contradictory, but despite upholding traditional gender roles, I argue that the FWP's nostalgia for old-timey food was not so much a yearning for the past as a blueprint for the future. How so? Well, the last archival entries take the America Eats project into the first months of direct involvement into World War II, a period that reoriented the project toward overtly nationalist goals. As one editor put it, if we can make Americans realize that they have the best table in the world, we shall have helped to deepen national patriotism. Wartime mobilization directly recruited American senses. They needed the gusto of traditional dishes. So by 1941, the disdain for industrial food was not so much a nostalgic matter anymore, but a concrete challenge for the mobilized nation. And I really like the following quote that a Kansas writer included in his notes. It's actually a clipping from a local newspaper that explains that no race will spring to man the barricades with its stomach stuffed with Waldorf salad nestled in a leaf of lettuce, plus a dab of store-bought mayonnaise on top. I quite like this quote. So despite its gender limits, the FWP interest in taste and commensality resulted in the creation of an exceptional food archive, documented local culinary practices. But it also means, and this is something we really have to remember, that America Eats is not a comprehensive survey of what Americans ate during the Depression, nor was the establishment of such a database the goal of the project. Rather, New Deal food writing nostalgically celebrated culinary stability to counteract anxieties about the impacts of industrial food, the Great Depression, and ultimately World War II on American foodways. And so this means that also that New Deal food writing focused really on rural communities and promoted an agrarian regionalist vision of the nation. This was kind of baked into the goal of America Eats in particular. And so it did not cover urban food habits very much, although a majority of Americans lived in cities by the 1930s. We have a few, there's interesting things in New York, especially description of the automat. So this new at the time sort of restaurants where, you know, you might be familiar with it, you would pay and then you open the little window and you get your piece of pie or your meatloaf. And so it's important to remember that it really puts the emphasis on rural food. And on regional food, because that was their goal. So for instance, what did the America Eats material for Pennsylvania consisted of? I figured you might be interested in this. Well, we have not many things, unfortunately. We have a 4-page essay on the mushroom industry in Chester County. It starts with citing the Roman poet Juvenal, before moving on to the latest composting innovations and a description of the mushroom growth cycle. Now, what I find really interesting, and as some of you may know, the trade association American Mushroom Institute, which was founded in 1955, still has its headquarters in the county. And according to them, Chester County still produces 60% of all mushrooms in the US. So the Federal Writers Project was onto something. Then we have a 22-page essay on Pennsylvania Dutch cooking. And I've quoted the opening of it already. And it describes Pennsylvania Dutch cooking as the original épice in American history. The first part describes in lyrical tone a dinner at the Shastersville Hotel in Berks County. And then the writer, Figure, goes on to describe the annual gathering of the Stumpf clan. And I cannot resist reading this rather long but epic paragraph. Slowly, with great deliberation, grace is said, and spoons dip noisily into the, well, to term it simply soup seems inadequate. Rather, we might say deep noisily into rich brown pools of liquid poetry. This was not one of your pale, watery concoctions out of a can. This was soup as it was meant to be. Soup as dreamt of by soup makers throughout the ages. A soup that is food to the soul as well as the body. It is an epic composed of butter, soup stock, seasoning, and grated cheese. It's quite the paragraph and the endorsement of this soup. The second part of the essay focuses on dishes, recipes, and cooking methods. So, for instance, we have details on the making of Philadelphia scrapple, Pfannkuchen, shoe-fly pie, Schnitzenknepp, and many other. And Figure, the writer, explains that the German pioneers clung to the menu of the fatherland, changing only as new food became available through contact with the Indians and the English. In time, game became scarce. Newspapers and almanacs printed recipes were tried so that some of the choice recipes of early days became obsolete. And finally, the third part of the essay described the pioneer kitchen and the product of the first farms in Pennsylvania. It then expands its focus on the food served in Philadelphia, so pepper pot, ice cream, and pies, And very interestingly, it also the essay also describes the eating habits of the Welsh of the Wyoming Valley, in particular Fagot and Frois. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. So that's what we have for Pennsylvania in terms of the essays, what was written at the local level. What's really interesting is that we also have the editorial comments that was sent back by the federal editor in 1942. And this is what they wrote. It is extremely unfortunate that this material deals so largely with Pennsylvania Dutch foods. While this group was important in state history, it never predominated. Also, there is nothing on the western end of the state and nothing at all on the social pattern revealed by group meals, which, as careful review of the outline would reveal, is the major theme of the book. Unless the Pennsylvania Writers Project can satisfactorily complete this brief assignment, Pennsylvania will be more poorly covered in this book than any other state. So what can we conclude from this? Well, I think that we see here the beginning of the food tourism industry in the Pennsylvania Dutch areas of the states. This is the food that the state writers wanted to highlight to the country at large, in hope that after reading about it, people would visit and taste the food. And so this essay and the state office really offered Pennsylvania Dutch cooking as a branded package to the country. And in that sense, they were pioneers of travel food writing. But it's also an awkward comment, since as the tirade on soup makes clear, the writer was exactly fulfilling their assignment and celebrated pre-industrial foodways in during a family reunion. But what's interesting in this comment too is the mention of this group, because it also hints at how the celebration of free industrial foodways in Pennsylvania and beyond complicated the appraisal of the role of ethnic and race groups in the making of American regional cuisines. Because the federal editors who put together the proposal for America Eats wanted the project to describe, quote, meals and dishes American in tradition, bringing up the question, whose food is American food anyway? And in a memo to regional offices, an editor explained that the amount of space that can be devoted to each region is so small that there is little room for what is merely exotic if one purpose of the book is to be fulfilled. This purpose is to increase appreciation of American traditions and traditions brought to this country and welded into the national life. This was problematic from the start because Washington never clearly defined what American and welded into the national life meant in this culinary context. And despite the editorial comments on the Pennsylvania contributions, other sources show that Pennsylvania Dutch food was broadly accepted as American. This was not really what this comment is about. But it was much more complicated for more recent immigrants, especially Southern and Eastern Europeans who had migrated to the US en masse from the middle of the 19th century up to 1924, when quota laws limited new immigration. And so an animated debate ran through the project's ranks as to whose food would, could, or should be considered American. So, for instance, we can recreate a really interesting exchange of letters between a federal editor and a Northeast Federal Writers Project bureau. The federal editor wrote that the section should provide an account of a Jewish group meal, preferably a traditional celebration. This is an exception to the rule against non-American material, but is justified by the number of Jews in the US and the ancient character of the feast. This did not sit well with the local writers, and the editor had to clarify a few days later that in reference to the Jewish feasts as non-American, they merely meant that they did not originate in the US, but they are, of course, American in the broader sense, as any feasts held in the US by natives of the country. So as you can see from this convoluted answer, the editors in DC were really writing themselves into a corner. And the foods of recent immigrants resisted being put into neat regional categories, yet they profoundly influenced regional taste. And overall, the federal office prescriptive culinary narrative tightened the threshold of American tradition and offered ethnic and racial communities only a tentative place in the present. So we can see this by revisiting one of the first photographs that I showed you, the one from the spaghetti dinner in Tantinton, Arkansas during the Grape Festival. What's interesting is that we have the photographs, but we also have the letter that was sent with the photograph. It was written by a local writer called Edward Moulton, and he noted that the festival had been an annual event for the past 40 years, before adding that the pictures might be irrelevant to the project, and that the event was, of course, not characteristic of Arkansas, since there were only a few scattered Italian communities in the state. Still, he thought that the pictures might conceivably be of some use. So clearly, 40 years of sensory presence in the southern state did not give the Italian community culinary legitimacy in the region. And yet, as the caption of a second photograph from the same event reveals, fried chicken was integral to the menu for the spaghetti dinner. So the way I interpret this is, to me, Moulton could not make sense of the ethnic taste of the Italian community in the rural South. He was also probably confused by the ambiguous messages coming from Washington. And so he chose to dismiss this spaghetti dinner altogether. And he left this Italian community on the threshold of America Eats. So as this example shows, the question that the local Federal Writers Project offices had to answer became really not what are American regional cuisine, as one might think at first, but really whose heritage would or could be considered American and regional. Spoiler alerts, they did not manage to answer this question. This is why you will note that my book is subtitled The Search for America's Food. Because once I started diving into America Eats and New Deal food writing in general, I quickly realized that this was not where I would find out what were American regional food in the 1930s, if that's even possible to do. That's a different debate. But I quickly became fascinated with the process of the search that the FWP embarked on. And I want to make clear that this does not mean that the America Eats material cannot be used to figure out what Americans ate during the 1930s, but it needs to be really carefully used. One has to do a fair amount of reading against the grain, because despite its limits when it comes to gender, race, and ethnicity, the America Eats material is an exceptional food archive documenting local culinary practices. And to my point, the Tantinton spaghetti dinner might have been axed from the final version if the book had been published. We will never know whether it would have made it or not, but it is part of the archives and we cannot ignore it. We have to account for it. It exists, it happened. We have to account for the culinary choices of this rural Southern Italian community. And in fact, 3 of the 5 chapters of my book use New Deal food writing, and in particular, the America Eats archive, against the grain to detangle the relationship between taste, race, and place in different regions, with a chapter on the South, one on the Southwest, and a final one on the messy concept of the melting pots. And so finally, I want to sort of go back to one of the things that I said early on, which is that, and that I just mentioned again, that America Eats was never finished and published. Why? Well, the most obvious answer is that the Federal Writers Project folded with the entry of the US into World War I. And in early 1942, it was recast as the Office of War Information, and writers were reassigned to work on an American camp guide series. You will remember that they had worked on a series of guidebooks to American states, so they kind of knew how to do that. All the unpublished materials and notes were sent to the Library of Congress and various other archives. But I also think that that America Eats never came to fruition because they were on an impossible search. Given their ambitious but ambiguous goal, they were sort of doomed to fail in my mind after 10 years of looking at all of this in various ways. But ultimately, the fact that they failed to publish the book is a gift to historians and, foodies of all stripes, since we have all the raw material, the archives, that in a way are more interesting than what the final product could have been if they had followed their own book outline and their memorandums. So now that you have been introduced to the project and its limits and the many cautions that I've just talked about, I invite you to do your own diving into America Eats, which you can now do thanks to this wonderful website put together by, I believe it's Michigan State University and the University of Michigan. They worked together. And they digitized all of the America Eats archive. So you can search it all on their website. And it's an exceptional resource because it also provides an incredible trove of 1930s food writing, including cookbooks. Especially they digitize a collection of community cookbooks, but also advertisement pamphlets. And in fact, this is where I got all of the pamphlets that I showed you tonight. I participated in this. It also provides comments and contextualization by food historian, especially if you go into the section Explore History and Spotlight Sources. And so, because when, and this was created by Helen Veit, whose book I showed you earlier, and really the goal was to, we realized quickly that America Eats can be easily misunderstood, and that, we needed to do some explanations about, you cannot entirely take it at face value. So what will you read about in the America Eats raw material on the What America Ate website? Well, you can read about an Italian feed in Vermont, the food of the Basques of the Boise Valley, a Boya picnic in Minnesota, a Florida shrimp pillow supper, the Possum Club of Polk County, but also an Arizona menudo party, a South Carolina barbecue, or Choctaw Indian dishes in Oklahoma. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. But again, take it with a grain of salt. As my talk has made clear, the literary value of the essays varies, And some of them are actually quite funny as well. But we also have to remember that the writers were not trained anthropologists or ethnographers, and their methods were not exactly scientific, and they did not have to follow any ethical code. And so this, when you read the America Eats material, you're always wondering what's true and what did they make up or at least embellish. But it's also the charm of this material. And this is ultimately why I spent a decade working on it. And in conclusion, I want to note that over a decade ago, Mark Kurlansky published selected passages of the America Eats archive under the eloquent title, A Portrait of American Food, before the national highway system, before chain restaurants, and before frozen food, when the nation's food was seasonal, regional, and traditional, from the lost WPA files. So 2 things. First of all, archives are never lost. They're just in the archives, but that's a side note. But more interestingly, the editors of America Eats might have agreed with this title. Indeed, they did search for traditional and regional dishes, the nostalgic foodways of an utopian past, but they did not find the foods of a younger land. And it was the very encroachment of mass-produced industrial food that triggered the New Deal nostalgic search for American regional cuisines. Yet I think that this misunderstanding of the project is also very informative because it layers the 1930s craving for real food with an early 21st century discontentment with the contemporary food system. And the New Deal's drive to record, protect, and publicize regional food is quite like our enthusiasm for local, quote unquote, good food. And in that sense, America Eats was and remains innovative. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, my book is not an account of what people ate in the 1930s. I'm very sorry if you came here tonight to learn about that. But if you want to have a better idea of what Americans actually ate during the 1930s, I would recommend this book by Jane Ziegelman and Andrew Coe, A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression. It's a really good read. And also of interest might be this book by Pat Willard, America Eats. It's a little bit of an odd one. She published some of the America Eats essays that Kurlansky also published, but then she went back to the same spots to see if some of the events were still happening, and sort of wrote also a little bit of a personal history mixed with it. So it's also an interesting one that has been published about the America Eats material. And on this, I will thank you for listening to me, and I will take any questions you may have. I don't know if you want to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. Maybe I can stop sharing my screen. That way I can see you. I can also see you without having to do that, discovering all the Zoom abilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimmy. That was so fabulous. Oh my gosh. And I loved all your photographs, and just all the graphics were wonderful. I'm happy to read through some of the questions in the chat, and then we can see if anyone wants to unmute and actually ask you a question, if that's okay. Maybe we could start that way. Dan, if I go back a little, some of them are just comments, which are kind of fun, how it evoked memories of stories of my mother and grandmother during their homesteading in Colorado. That was Susan Edwards. And then Ingrid commented how she still uses her mother-in-law's cooking utensils with Bakelite handles from the 1930s, never rusted. better time when people used inventive ways to cook and feed their families. Then Susan mentioned Escoffier extolled commercial canned foods, springtime on the pantry shelf. And I guess the first real question is, Dan asked, did the writers have a photographer accompany them to the event they wrote about? So that's a really interesting question.
It is. I think the answer is unfortunately no. There are a few other photographs from America Eats. And there's one that I have put in, there's one from the South that I find absolutely fascinating. And I have it here. Because I mean, this is the 1930s, this is the Jim Crow South, but the chapter that I mentioned on the South, I really go into how the food is the same. Obviously, it depends on your class and your what you can afford, right? Like if you can live high or low on the hog. But ultimately the Southern whites have no problem with having Black cooks. So there is a sensory intimacy there, right? Like you have Black cooks, you more or less, actually less than more, but like the food was also invented by the Black cooks, but there's this, you don't eat together, but the food tends to be the same. And, the biscuits and things like that. Obviously there is a matter of class difference as well, or just, what you can afford to buy, or what you grow on your, if you're a sharecropper. But what's interesting to me is that here, the food separates them, but the food tends to be the same, although there is also this, this sort of net. So it's very unclear. So we have all these, and it looks like you also have some women looking at the sharecroppers, right? Because this is on a plantation. And obviously there's more sharecroppers that are there than white people, probably because they need more of the food that's offered by the owner. So there's some other photographs that are quite interesting, and that and there's others that I include in the book, but I couldn't go into all of this. But I find this one in particular really interesting. And as I mentioned, you got me started on photographs. I made a point in the book that there's no photographs that I use as illustrations. They're all, I write about every photograph that's included because it's part of the analysis. And so I wrote about New Deal food writing. So it's a bit larger than just America Eats, although America Eats is really the core of what I wrote about. But we also have, I really like these two photographs. See, I was ready to speak about photographs, so I included extra slides. They're from the Federal Writers Project Guide to California. And I'm always struck when I look at them by how similar they are in some of the composition, but also how dissimilar they are in some of the, industrial food, hygienic food, and then the tortilla maker that's smoking over her dough. But at the same time, it's like there's way more warmth in the tortilla maker image than in the image of the cannery worker who's not even looking at the photograph of at the camera. She's looking at what she's doing. So I also go into, I have a few pages on these two photographs because I have the tortilla maker in my kitchen because I find they're high quality photographs. and ultimately the cannery worker might be Mexican American as well, because that is the workforce that was and is still working in the food industry in California. So yeah, but it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't a systematic thing.
No, it's fascinating. Absolutely. The next question is also from Dan, and he asks, don't you think that maybe part of the reason the book wasn't published at the time is that the writers didn't give the editors what they really wanted, number one, and number two, that a lot of the writing was just not very good.
Yeah, that's there's also that. And they didn't, and at the same time, when you read it, I always feel sorry for the writers, because they kind of give them what they wanted, and the writing was, spotty, but you could do something with it. And I mean, I was kind of mischievous by saying like they were writing themselves into a corner, but ultimately it's that they folded and it was like, okay, no, we have something else to do. And we live in a very food-oriented society where there's organization like yours, there's a lot of food writing, a lot of food magazines, but like gourmet didn't even exist before the 1940s, right? So like it was a really, writing a book on food and American food was a bit of a, you're like out to lunch kind of idea. So it was an easy one to scrap.
Right. And then also when you have so many writers working together, it's tough because they all have a different voice. So it's you have to kind of meld it all into one voice too, unless it is like each chapter separate. So I don't know. That's always a
that's why
challenge.
they wrote, the goal was to write these section essays, so these 5 section essays, and they were actually this draft of the section essays. They realized that like they basically appointed a state per region to blend everything in, but then you end up with like literally a blended but bland essay.
Right. That's the
So
other.
yeah, it wasn't the greatest setup.
Right. Well, and like you said, it's a good learning tool for us going forward, anyone who's interested in culinary. So that's always a good thing in the history. Eileen Mercer asks, what got you interested in this particular subject?
Well, it's interesting. I first read about this archive in a book by Donna Gabaccia, which is called We Are What We Eat, American Food. It's about like ethnic Americans and American food. I'm misquoting the title, but it's a very good book. I want to look it up now. I'm turning my head, I don't have it on my bookshelf over there. But ultimately, as I mentioned, I'm French, and then I moved to Toronto, and everybody asks you. I wasn't doing food history when I moved there, and then everybody asks you like, "Oh, do you like cook French at home?" And you're like, "But I cook the food that I know. What do you mean by cook French?" I eat green beans, and I'll make a bechamel. I don't need a recipe. But so it's really this experience of moving that got me interested in food history, and it's one that in Toronto a lot of people have. And then finding this archive. Now what's really funny is that whenever I would go back to France and say like, "Oh, I'm working on American food history," they were like, "What?"
Yeah.
But I made my points. I argued.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Susan Edwards asks, she just says, I was a professional chef for 25 years. Dan makes the comment that's so interesting that we can continue to find authentic food of a place. George also had asked how you got interested in the topic, so thank you for answering that just previously. Paul asks, was a similar effort made to identify Canadian foods / foodways during the Depression?
Not that I know of, but if you're interested in Canadian food in that time period, there's a book, well, actually during the war by Ian Mosby called Food Will Win the War, that probably has a little bit more, but I don't think there was such a concerted effort.
Okay. And then he also said the New Deal editors seemed to struggle a bit with what was considered American food. How would it be defined today? Still unsettled?
It's a question back to you. I think now it's a bit more open, right? Like there's this idea that anything goes, that it's about, we are like in the post-fusion food world, right? So they're in the pre-fusion food world. But what's interesting is that ultimately, because there was the quota laws in 1924 that really restricted immigration by Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, very quickly, it's the second generation that takes over. And that sort of this, I think this is why in the post-war period, you see things like the Philadelphia cheesesteak becoming much more representative of a local regional food, but they're not quite there yet in the 1930s.
Right. And then Dan asks, did the state guidebooks contain much food tourism destinations?
So it's not the same thing. It depends on the guidebooks, because the guidebooks were really much more state efforts with, I think, a bit less, I guess, feedback and ordering around from the federal office. But it's especially, you see it, there's like entire sort of chapters on food in the guidebooks for the southern states, which I find really interesting because they also realize, this is something that sets them apart from other states. And then there's also, I really enjoyed all the material from, I guess, what America Eats would call the Southwest or the Middle West. There's a lot on the chuck wagon and cowboy food. And so again, going back into this like masculinist, you think like, oh, food, it's going to be about women. And then in this material, it's like all about men cooking and cooking manly food. And so it's, so the answer is, it depends on the state guidebooks, but a good local, I think if you're based in Philadelphia, you can probably find in the library, in the city library, you can probably find all of the guidebooks. Some of them were actually republished in like maybe in the 80s, 90s. But I know that the entire series is at the New York Public Library. If you are really interested.
That's just like a piece of food or a piece of history right there. I know those food guides is funny because then a few some years later, Duncan Hines was the one going around the different restaurants, putting his 2 cents worth and doing the reviews and stuff. So it's kind of interesting how that did become a thing. I had one question about, the photo with the spaghetti and fried chicken. So was that kind of like an Arkansas thing? Because it's funny here in this area, there was this big, fried chicken and waffles was a thing together. But like, you don't often think of pairing spaghetti with fried chicken. Was that just because those were 2 things easy to make for a crowd? Or was that something in Arkansas that they maybe did more often? Or You don't
So
know?
it's the only, at least in America Eats, it's the only time it appears. The way I explained it is that these are Italian immigrants that, as the letter mentions, there's been a community for 40 years. So, you know, they're still making the spaghettis, but they've also been in contact with the local foodways for half a century. So they would know of fried chicken, have learned to enjoy fried chicken. And so they're having a community dinner. They make both, you know, maybe to satisfy the older generation and the younger generation. But that's what I find really interesting, is that they make both.
Right, yeah, it's not something that is, you know, commonly
Yeah.
paired
I
together
don't
like
think
that.
it's a thing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But I know like those big dinners, like, you know, they always did like they can feed a lot of people too. So that's the
Yeah.
other part of that. Well, that's the last question in the chat. But if anyone wants to either raise their hand, you know, feature, or just unmute. Dan said he's gonna make spaghetti and fried chicken for dinner tomorrow. I know
I'll
well,
have-
first of all, kids would love it, right? I mean, that's to feed the little kids for sure. Your son would probably like that, right? But
Yeah.
does anyone have any other questions or comments? Or this was just so fabulous, and I never even knew about this. So I think I had mentioned on our call earlier when we met that I want to write a book about processed food. So this kind of, I can use this as kind of a stepping stone. But yeah, if anyone else has
It's
any-
so interesting that, you know, processed food was evil even when it started.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So there's
That was fantastic.
a lot we can say about it for sure. But this was so good. And
Was it I just read the process for canning food was invented by a Frenchman during the Napoleonic Wars.
yes, and war is a big way
Neil,
that
it's your
food-
fault.
yeah, food is created through war a lot of time. You know, like that's what they
Yeah.
need to do.
It's
And
interesting. It goes that far back. I mean, it's like incredible, you know.
right.
They did it in glass at that point. I'm not sure that it was in aluminum can.
Well, there's one
Right.
in tins.
And,
Yeah.
You can look it up, you know, but that
was-
ended up poisoning a lot of people too.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was hard to perfect it because
With
they
the
couldn't
lead.
get that. Yeah.
Trial and error. Oh gosh.
Exactly. So, but
No, and
Yeah.
it's kind of it's something that I didn't mention, but this relationship to war as well, because we tend to think of American food history as, you know, it's after the war that you have a lot of frozen food really takes off after the war, but you have the TV dinners and things like that. But like this material sort of like brings it back in time a little bit by saying like, no, this happened earlier than the 40s and 50s, and sort of shifts a little bit the timing, the chronology of this.
It's interesting. My father was an immigrant from Norway, and my mother's Swedish descent, and she grew up in Brooklyn. But when I was a kid, I got treated to all kinds of like ethnic food in America. And my father was in the Korean War, so I was born in El Paso, Texas, on an army base. But I grew up eating Mexican food and Norwegian food and Swedish. And then we used to go to New York for Chinese food. And then we went for German. So I think like we had, and then all the community, you know, dinners, you know, we sat in those slatted wood chairs, you know, that was in the picture, the other picture, I remember those chairs. But it was a lot of fun because it was like a smorgasbord and that's the way I look at American food. It's a smorgasbord of all of us, you know, so it's a lot of fun. But yeah, my father thought that was it Spam, the canned meat. He thought that was the best thing going. So, because they didn't have much in Norway, and it was just, you know, just the World War II was just beginning. So
Very
There's quite a
cool.
bit of
interesting. Thank you.
There's quite a bit on Scandinavian food in America. It's in the material on like Minnesota and the Midwest, and lutefisk and smorgasbord. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah, those areas actually end up being, they preserve a lot of the older foods. Like if you go to Norway, they're not cooking that anymore, but it becomes like a time capsule in America with a lot of dishes that come over here. And the same thing with Italian food. My husband's Italian descent. And they go, we don't make that. No.
Mm. Yeah, if you go to Italy, you're not going to find the food that they're serving in Italian restaurants in New York
Exactly.
at all. Yeah.
Interesting though.
So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Time capsule.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure I give Kemi back her evening. So I really appreciate you coming here. You're getting all these thank yous in the chat. And I just, I can't thank you enough for giving such a fabulous presentation to us. And, I wish you all the best in all your future research. Absolutely. So,
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to go back to this material. I hadn't had the chance to in a while, and it's always fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I love the way you targeted Pennsylvania a little for us.
Yeah,
That was
thank you
very
so much.
kind
Yeah.
and thoughtful. So really fun.
Especially the mushrooms.
Yeah. So
I didn't know that. See, I learned something.
yeah, there you go. Well, thanks again, and have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Great program.